The fourth word. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?
God, my God, why have you forsaken me? We've come with this word from the cross to a very dark place. In fact, to the darkest place imaginable. From the first 3 words of the cross, we were able to derive some light, insights about forgiveness, about happiness, about freedom. But now with this word, it seems we're just stopped short. This is a Jesus who seems simply out of control. A Jesus who's entered into that very darkest place, meaninglessness. We all know that beyond physical suffering, there's a far greater suffering. Because whatever your physical suffering, if you can put it in the context of meaning, you can endure it. But when meaning itself is lost, it seems as though everything's lost. Whenever I hear this word, I think now of Matthias Grunewald's great masterpiece, the Eisenheim altarpiece. When I was filming the Catholicism series, one of our stops was in Colmar, it's in France, where the Eisenheim altarpiece is on display. You've probably seen a reproduction of it, or maybe you've been there. But Grunewald gives us, I think, the most powerful and theologically rich depiction of the crucifixion in Western art. Because there's Jesus, not serenely in control, but his limbs twisted out of shape in pain, his head covered in this impossibly painful crown of thorns. But the worst part of the painting for me, the most powerful, is that Jesus' mouth is simply agape in silent agony. It seems to be a Christ who's just uttered those words, God, my God, why have you abandoned me? About 10 years ago, I was preaching in the parish, and I finished a homily on God's providence, God's goodness, how God's at work in the world. So after Mass, a man came up to me, a man in his late 60s. He said, Father, I'm on a quest, and your homily didn't help. I said, what's your quest? He said, well, I've got 2 granddaughters. They both have a disease that's so mysterious that even the doctors at the Mayo Clinic can't understand quite what it is. All they know is that first the person goes blind, and then she dies from the disease. My older granddaughter, he said, is already blind. And the younger one cries out at night in fear as she contemplates her future. Father, how do you explain that? That was one Sunday morning after Mass. God, my God, why have you abandoned me? Now, that wasn't an atheist talking to me. That was someone just at Mass. That was a believer, but who was feeling that pain. God, my God, why have you abandoned me? Back at my first assignment when I was in the parish, I read in the paper the story about a policeman who inexplicably, to everyone, got up one night, took his service revolver, and with it shot his own son to death, and then killed himself. So I read that terrible story in the paper. Well, about 2 days later, I was in the local funeral parlor attending the wake of a parishioner. I came out from the wake, and I saw in the adjoining room 2 coffins, which of course is an unusual sight. And I looked up and I saw the name, and I said, it's the policeman and his son. Now, I didn't know them at all. I don't think they were Catholic, but I just felt some obligation to go in. I had, of course, my Roman collar on. And I went into the room, and over to me came the wife and mother. And we didn't exchange any words. All she did was this. She went, as if to say, Father, explain this to me. God, my God, why have you abandoned me? You know, the new atheists are on the prowl today, and I don't think their arguments are very good, because I think the only really telling argument against God's existence is this one. John Stuart Mill in the 19th century put it this way: if God exists, there really couldn't be evil. Because God, we hear, is omnibenevolent, he's omniscient and omnipotent. Well, if he's omnibenevolent, he'd want to do something about evil. If he's omnipotent, he could do something about evil. If he's omniscient, he'd know all about evil. Therefore, there wouldn't be any evil if God exists. Thomas Aquinas, many centuries before, put it even more pithily. In one of his objections to God's existence, he said, if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be destroyed. But God is called the infinite good. Therefore, there should be no evil. Now, can I submit to you, friends, those are darn good arguments. As I say, the only ones I think are really powerful against the claim that God exists. A lot of us feel in our heart of hearts the agony of those words. God, my God, why have you abandoned me? Does the Bible know about this? You bet it does. Go back to the Old Testament. The book of Job is the most powerful biblical wrestling with this problem in the Old Testament. You know the story, of course. Righteous Job is beset with every possible suffering. In one fell swoop, he loses home, livelihood, money, family, health, everything. His wife, Mrs. Job, has one of the great one-liners in the Bible, not very pastorally helpful. She says to Job, well, curse God and die. Not a helpful pastoral strategy. Job's friends come along. I put friends in quotes. And they say, well, Job, I mean, come on, you must have done something to deserve all this suffering. You must have offended God somehow. Job says, no, he knows he's righteous. And then, in one of the most dramatic scenes in the Bible, Job dismisses his friends and he calls God himself into the dock. Like that grandfather, like that mother and wife that I met, he calls God into the dock. Explain yourself to me. Why have you allowed this suffering? Look in the 38th chapter of Job. I tell my students at the seminary, memorize that chapter. It's God's longest speech in the whole Bible. God speaks out of the desert whirlwind. Beautiful image. The desert whirlwind that's kicking up the dust and getting in Job's eyes because he can't see. And God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I instructed the sun where to rise? Where were you when I told the hail and the snow and the ice? God then takes Job on this great tour of the whole cosmos, revealing to him all of its intricacy, all of its strangeness, all of its mystery. Where were you? You know everything, Job. You tell me. At the climax of the speech, God points out to Job two of his creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. Scholars think it might have meant a crocodile, maybe a hippopotamus, we don't know. But God sings the praises of Behemoth and Leviathan, these two creatures. And he says to Job, how wonderful they are. These two creatures whom I made just as I made you. You see the point? Job, you think your life's about you, and you're seeing your suffering from the standpoint of your own life. But Job, you are part of an infinitely complex drama, painting, story that I'm composing that includes all of space and all of time. Yes, Job, you are suffering. But the sense that it makes occurs within this infinitely complex drama that God is writing. Think for a second of this great cathedral, all of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Look at, in all of its darks and lights, all of its play of color, all the intricacy of its design. Suppose now that this cathedral represents God's great work across all of space and all of time. We see how all of it fits together harmoniously. Suppose I were to look down there at that corner of this podium and were to say to you, on the basis of that vision, St. Patrick's Cathedral is the ugliest cathedral I've ever seen. St. Patrick's Cathedral means nothing. There's no harmony or order to it. How much do we see of God's great composition? One tiny swath of space and time. It's a bit like taking one sentence out of one paragraph of War and Peace and reading that one sentence and saying, this novel makes no sense. Maybe the sentence you read is a very dark and troubling sentence. How much do we read of God's great novel? Here's an image from William James, the American philosopher. James would work all day at his desk, and then at the end of the day, his dog would come in to visit with his master. The dog would come in happily, wagging his tail, and he would take in everything in the office. He would see the desk covered in papers. He'd see the shelves filled with books. He'd see the globe in the corner. He'd see all of it, but understand none of it. And if William James endeavored to explain to the dog what all that meant, oh, these papers are filled with symbols that signal to my mind ideas. The books are collections of further semiotic signs that trigger to my mind certain ideas. See that globe in the corner? It's a depiction of the planet we all live on that's hurtling through space. How much would the dog understand? None of it. It occurred to William James, he saw everything but got almost nothing. Now, imagine how we're seen by a higher power. We who think that we see it all. Yeah, well, maybe we do, but we get almost none of it. And what if an angel or God himself endeavored to explain it to us? Even in principle, he couldn't make sense of it. Do you have these in New York? I wonder, about 20 years ago, these kind of mean ladybugs blew into Chicago. I think from China or something. Ladybugs, when I was a kid, were just kind of these harmless things. But these new ladybugs sort of blew in, and they come during the fall, and they invade all of our homes, our space. Well, I was in my office one day. I was working on a book of theology. And I saw up in the corner of my window on the screen 5 of these little ladybugs. It was kind of a cold day, so they were huddled together. In the course of my time in the office, they moved maybe 1/4 of an inch in different directions. Next day I came back, continuing my work on my theological book, and I saw the ladybugs had clustered again in that little corner, and now they moved 1 inch, perhaps. I thought, big day for you today. You're moving 1 inch on my screen. And I remember that day thinking, with infinite condescension, what stupid little things. Here I am in my office, working on my books of theology. And look at those stupid little creatures. A big day for them is moving 1 inch on my screen. And then it occurred to me, like a grace from God, how I must be seen by the angels. I who think I'm so exalted in writing my important books, and here I am in my office. To an angel, I would look like one of those silly little ladybugs crawling along the screen. Part of the rationale of the book of Job is, don't presume to think that you can pronounce on the meaningfulness of the universe or of your life. Because what we grasp of God's purposes is so small. Okay, fair enough, true enough, illuminating enough. Yeah, I think all that makes some sense, sheds some light. But does it solve the problem of that grandfather I talked about? Would sharing these ideas solve the problem for that wife and mother? I doubt it. Then we listen to this word again. God, why have you abandoned me? Who is saying that? Not just a suffering human being, but according to our faith, the one who says that is the very Son of God. The very Son of God, out of love for us, went into our darkest place. Went into that place where we are most afraid, where we are most confounded. Entered into it so fully that Chesterton could say, on the cross, it's as though God became an atheist. To grasp that, friends, is to get very close to the dizzying paradox of our faith. On the cross, it's as though God became an atheist, meaning the Son of God, out of love, went into that place that frightens us the most. That's the ultimate answer. Because now God himself brings light to that darkest place.